All right, we are finally live there. It was a delayed kickoff. I pressed record about 10 seconds ago. Maybe you saw me just staring at the screen, maybe not, but no better way to get the college football season started. 2024 college football betting you here at Odd Chopper. I am Ben Rasa. That is the man, Matt Gajewski, and we are back. We are going to be talking about all sorts of things college football related. We'll get into it in just a second, but sir, you've been in the baseball streets. You've been behind the scenes working. You're back home. You must feel pretty good to talk a little college football.
Absolutely. The excitement for the season seems to grow every single day. It's been a busy offseason, as you well know, just with college football ever changing. So many moving parts from the transfer portal to NIL to realignment. And then we actually have to talk about the team. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been an exciting offseason, and I'm excited for it. How are you? Are you excited for the season?
I'm super excited. Obviously, the big news is that Kennesaw State is in. They are part of the dance now. Not going to make the show today, but maybe they'll make a future show. Yeah, I feel great. Obviously, last couple of years, the portal has changed my prep. It's certainly changed your prep. It's a year-round situation. I feel pretty good. What we're doing today, let's get into it. We're going to talk about our favorite win totals. Certainly, we're going to have conference breakdowns in the future, but we took all the teams and we said, okay, let's throw together, we each took about 5, give or take, our favorite win totals, and we're going to talk about them in the show. Before we get to the win totals, though, I want to take a macro view with you if I can. Just very basic, your thoughts on the season of who stood out as maybe the teams to beat. What do you think the landscape looks like? Does Georgia come back to it? Michigan, I certainly don't think that Michigan is a serious threat, but maybe you do. What are your just general thoughts on the year?
I'm excited for the 12-team playoff. It's sort of some give and take. The traditionalist in me loves the old regional structure that we had, but with the Big Ten and the SEC dominating everything, we're going to get amazing games week in and week out. More of them, too. It's not going to be Ohio State plays Rutgers in Maryland every single week, and you're only really looking forward to the final game against Michigan. You have loaded weeks throughout the season, so that's nice. I kind of don't buy that it's going to diminish the regular season either, just with so many high-profile games throughout the year. I think it's going to be pretty exciting. And then I live by the philosophy that more football is better, so an increased playoff is awesome. I personally think the 4 best teams are in 2 conferences, which is really interesting for the playoff because you're going to have the auto bids for the winners, but that's going to leave some really good teams. I personally think it's Georgia and Texas. So whoever doesn't win conference likely is going to have a first round game. Ohio State, Oregon. We're going to talk about at least one of those teams today. One of those teams is going to have to play a first round game. And those are 2 really good teams that are going to have to actually show their faces in the first part of the playoffs. So it's going to be fun. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, no doubt. And those 2 teams, we will be talking about them, and they play during the year out in Eugene, which is going to be very interesting. No doubt about that. Do you see that this is a path to, certainly you're going to get more teams in the playoffs. Do you still think ultimately year in and year out, it's going to come down to the big dogs? Or do you think that there are teams on the fringe now that will get their chance? The Liberties of the world, or do you think it's just not, it's still, there's such a talent gap?
There's a large talent gap. Liberty is probably just a little too far off. We'll talk about them when we eventually talk about Conference USA. Holy smokes, they have an easy schedule. But that kind of brings up, a larger point, which I think is going to be a huge talking point throughout the season. And of course, even when we have the 4-team playoff, the BCS, you can never make anyone happy. There's always a controversy when you get to the national championship, and in this case, the playoff. But with that really easy schedule, is the committee going to defer to win-loss? Or are they going to maybe take a Boise State, who is a much more difficult non-conference, and put them in the playoff? And this is increasingly important because of the pressure that's being put on the committee in college football in general by Big Ten and Big Ten and SEC country. Basically, not so lightly threatening that they are willing to go off and make their own federation, whatever you want to call it, if they're actually going to be penalized for playing these extremely tough schedules. We kind of saw this last year with Florida State not making the playoff, to the outrage of a lot of people. They clearly were not a top 4 team, so I had no issues with it. But that's going to be, I think, ever increasing part of this discussion that we talk about as we get to the college football playoff era with 2 mega conferences.
It is going to be very, very interesting. And yeah, we certainly saw it last year with that was just such an insane run out. And then, they didn't participate in the bowl. Physically they were there. I'm not sure mentally they were there. They lost by like 90 points, but that's a story for another time. Again, we will see what jumps out. I more was interested in terms of my preseason wagers in win totals than futures. I don't have any major futures. Do you want to throw anything out there, or do you want to move in to our favorite win totals?
I haven't placed anything in the national championship
or
the Heisman markets. Right now, my plan is to maybe wait for some preseason injuries. Those always happen. Someone with Notre Dame the other day. Luckily, I wasn't betting them anyway. And then in season, there's always a lot of really good in-season opportunities for national championship. You're not locking your money up as long if you place like a natty future in week 5 and you have more information. So that's kind of the way I've liked to approach it in recent seasons.
Listen, let's dive into it. And friends, of course, a couple of things. One, if you are new betting you, welcome to the family. We break it down every single week. You let us know what you want to see. You know how to get in touch with this man, Matt_Gajewski on Twitter, at JazzRazBets on Twitter. Please, first episode, give us a like, share this, subscribe. Let's run it up. It's a new year, and we couldn't be more excited to take the momentum and the good work we did last year and just make it that much better. Here we go. I'm kicking us off. I'm going to lead the dance here as I zoom in, and I'm starting with a big team. We alluded to them already. We've got the Ohio State Buckeyes. I'm interested to see if you are high or low on them. I personally am high on them. If you want to lock up your money and you don't mind laying some juice, I do not see this team losing 2 games. It's as simple as that. I'm going to keep this short and sweet. Teams that I think they could lose to. They certainly could lose at Oregon. They could lose at Penn State. They always struggle there. And they could lose to Michigan. I don't think they're going to lose 2 of 3. I'm a big Will Howard fan. Obviously, Downs, super transfer. And I just think they have the most talent. I think they might run the table. I think they'll be 11-1 at worst. Keeping it very simple, I'm really high on Ohio State. I think they cruise to the playoff, even if they lose to Oregon, which I think is the biggest threat.
Oregon is by far the biggest threat. This is a big 2 in this conference, and then there's a sizable gap. You talk about winnable games, or losable games, I should say. Penn State and Michigan, I guess, technically are losable games, but there is still a massive talent gap between the roster of Ohio State and, say, that of Penn State. At Oregon's the toughest spot, but, lucky for you, that's just 1 game. They can drop that game and still eclipse this win total. And I mean, for playoff stuff, future stuff, they're likely to get revenge on Oregon later, at least have the opportunity for it in a Big Ten championship setting. And then maybe even a playoff. You could see teams play each other 3 times in a given season this year. But yeah, you touched on the roster. Will Howard's an upgrade on what they were trotting out with McCord. Judkins to complement Henderson. It wasn't that they lacked talent last year. It was more of the injury bug. So now you just add depth. Receiver, you lose Marvin Harrison Jr., generational talent. But I mean, these guys, they don't grow on trees, but they might as well at Ohio State. You have Jeremiah Smith coming in. Carnell Tate was an elite recruit last year on top of Ibuka. O-line has 4 starters back. Tackle's still a bit of a concern as it was last year, but the defense is really what's going to win this team games. I like to go not just look at starts for players, but see who played significant snaps. So kind of cutting that off at 300 or more snaps. They have 10 guys back who did that, all elite talents. And they filled their lone safety spot with Caleb Downs, who legitimately might be the best safety in the entire country entering his sophomore season. Just absolutely unbelievable freshman season for him at Alabama. I mean, this roster's loaded. The only problem for me is like Oregon is loaded too. We won't do their full breakdown, but yeah, man, I like the wiggle room you have here with an over.
Yeah, and I get it. And this is not that this is super important. I think this is kind of do or die. For Mr. Day, got to get it done this year, and I think
that's crazy.
Will. Yeah, it really is, but it's like if they go 10-2 and they miss the playoffs, something, it's not going to work. And I just think they have that wiggle room. If they beat Oregon, I see basically no chance that this does. I would be absolutely floored if they lost 2 games outside of that. That I don't see happening. So I'll lead us off with that. I'm going to pass it to you, and we're going to Miami. They got a good transfer of their own. You boys, talk to me about Miami and where we're at there. Buy, sell. What are we doing with the Hurricanes?
This is likely to generate at least some comments, I would think. probably on the negative end. I've also been a Miami buyer for maybe the last 3 years.
Both
and a lot of
have,
that,
sadly.
yep. A lot of that stems from what Cristobal has done as a recruiter in the talent acquisition game that Miami excels at. They're number 4 in recruiting again this year, top 10 in the transfer portal. You mentioned a couple guys they brought in, Cam Ward, Damian Martinez, a running back. They add some depth at receiver, Sam Brown, tons of good defensive transfers everywhere, which is really important for this team. They did lose a bit of talent, but the concern is always going to be Cristobal. He has found ways to lose this team games individually, which is insane because I like both of the coordinators he has on this team. I would just love if he would take more of a hands-off approach on the in-game stuff, focus on recruiting, building talent, which is what he's great at. But at the end of the day, this is still an on-field product. It's still a talent acquisition game. And when I look at Miami versus Clemson versus Florida State, they have advantages across the board. Quarterback, you're talking Cam Ward versus DJ Uiagalelei and Cade Klubnik. I'll take Cam Ward. Running back, I mean, Florida State's going to run out some sort of committee with Roydell Williams, Jalen Lucas. I don't know. Clemson does have Phil Maffa back, but you bring in Damian Martinez. You couldn't find a better transfer in the portal. Florida State loses their elite receivers. Now you're turning to some combination of like Malik Benson, who failed at Alabama, Jalen Brown, Hakeem Williams, I guess. He's a former 4-star, but he hasn't played. And Clemson's receiving corps, they're going to either rely on poor depth or they're going to need a freshman to step up. They do have some great freshman receivers, but they're still freshmen. Miami has Xavier Restrepo, Jacoby George, like proven commodities, along with every single one of their depth pieces being a 4- and 5-star. Their defense is awesome. Ruben Bain was elite off the edge last year. Offensive line is very good, returning a lot of production. Both their tackles are back. And when they did use the portal, especially on defense, they're taking elite players from other programs. Like Hill from Marshall comes in at defensive back. You have Taylor from Arizona, Powell from Washington in the secondary, Alderman from Louisville, Alston on the defensive line, Barrow on the defensive line from Michigan State. They're just loaded with talent. And I think this is the best team in the conference. It's not really a long shot, but I did take them to win the conference. And you can find that around 4-1. Also think win totals are fine, but honestly, they're going to have to go through some of those teams at the top of the conference. They play Florida and non-con. So rather than take a win total with Florida on the schedule, I would rather just play this as a longer shot compared to Clemson and Miami in the futures market to win this conference.
Fair enough. Yeah, they dodged Clemson in the regular season, I believe.
Yeah, they just have Florida State.
Yeah, Florida State. You mentioned Florida. If you do go win total, you have a 9 at -125. You can get plus money at over 9.5. So you've got some room. And once again, you have now, let it be known, we're early in episode 1, but when Miami is, 6-5 trying to get to a bowl game, it was not me, because I do this every year, and then they can't even kneel properly, as we saw last year.
They did mess that up, but a little bit in their defense. Like their starting quarterback got hurt in the middle of the season last year. Fletcher, their running back, was hurt last year. They had a ton of injuries on defense. Cameron Kinchin's only played 10 games. James Williams at safety missed a game. Porter at corner missed 3 games. Like their defensive line had a ton of injuries too. Like Nigel Kelly's not there anymore, but he only played 5 games. I mean, this team was depleted with injuries. So I think that also works in their favor too, if you want to play that game.
Yeah, I mean, I bet Van Dyke to win the Heisman. So that just shows you what happened last year. Now he's your problem. That's a future episode, but that's neither here nor there. All right, another team, and we didn't script this in this way, but it's kind of, to me, similar. That is Miami-esque as Texas A&M. A lot of hype, elite recruits, hasn't broken through in any monster way. Could this be the year for them to take that step, or are they still behind all the regulars in the SEC?
I personally like Texas A&M a lot. There's a couple bets that I did take already. They're over win total 8.5 to make the playoffs. That's plus 220. And then I also bet them in week 1 against Notre Dame as a pick 'em. Got really lucky with the Notre Dame left tackle getting injured yesterday. So I don't know. That might be at like -1 or something now. But there's a lot of reasons why Texas A&M should improve. First of all, they get rid of Jimbo Fisher. running this antiquated offense from 2013 with Florida State, never changed, and it clearly did not evolve with college football. He also did not maximize the talent on the field. And part of that is injury. Wegman has barely been able to stay healthy. That is a legitimate concern. But you're at points last year, they lost their backup. They were moving on to number 3 quarterback, Jalen Henderson, who actually played reasonably well, which shocked me. But injuries were a big problem with this team. Locker room issues, big problem. Now you move to Mike Elko, who's the former Duke head coach, and what he did there is absolutely insane. He's always been a coach that's done a lot with a little, and now he has a lot. Texas A&M still recruiting at elite levels. They were top 20 this year. They're number 4 in the transfer portal. They return all 3 of their stud running backs, and these are all really high recruits. Owens is a former 5-star. Moss was the most efficient. They lose some talent in the receiving room, but because of injuries, like Evan Stewart and Aeneas Smith, you had a bunch of guys get snaps. Like Moose Muhammad, Noah Thomas, and Jade Walker all played really well. Donovan Green's back from injury. You have 5 players on the offensive line with starting experience over 300 snaps. You bring in 3 pretty high-profile transfers there. This is one of the top offensive lines in the conference. And on defense, there's just such an awesome blend of returning 5- and 4-star talent and transfers. For reference, you bring in the guy like Nick Scorton from Purdue. He was the best player on Purdue last year. Not even close. He's now joining an edge group that has like Malik Silla and Shamar Stewart, 2 elite recruits formerly. A guy like Gabriel Brownlow-Dindley on the defensive line, former 5-star, is like barely played. This team is so loaded with talent. It's unbelievable. And you do have some guys that are worth mentioning as departures, like Edrin Cooper's gone. He was the best defender on the team. But you go and you backfill that with Solomon DeShields from Pitt. He was awesome last year. Probably doesn't play quite as well as Cooper, but you might be 90% of that. The same thing in the defensive backfield, like BJ Mays from UAB. Will Lee was awesome with Kansas State. And, if some of these guys can't step up to the competition of the SEC, you have some elite level recruits like Des Ricks from Alabama. He was an absolutely monster recruit, comes over to Texas A&M for more of an opportunity. And this is also partially, you have some teams in the SEC that are going through some changes. Alabama doesn't have Nick Saban anymore. I still personally really like them, but there's some concerns. LSU, they're replacing almost everything on offense aside from their offensive line. You're changing coordinators. There's just a lot of uncertainty. Tennessee's changing quarterbacks. With a team that actually has some consistency, I do like A&M, and I think they're worth a long shot. Probably not to win the SEC, but you're probably going to see 3 teams from this conference get in the playoff. I think at 220 there is nice, and then I do like over their win total. I think a lot of that hinges on Notre Dame, who they probably beat in week 1.
Yeah, if they beat Notre Dame, that's going to be 4 in non-con. The rest of their non-con is a joke. It's 3 freebies. So then you're looking at, you've got 5 cracks at it in SEC, and they got Arkansas on the schedule. They've got a couple others that are definitely doable. Auburn's on the schedule. So I see it. It's a team I get sucked into every year as well. All right, I'll give you one more. Then we'll tell you about some of the there's been some major changes around the Odd Shopper streets, and I'm going to tell you about that in a second. But of all the teams, if I could have only given you one team to hear you talk about, it would have been this one, and it's Virginia Tech. This is a team that I really am bullish on. The line has moved a little bit, and I still kind of like it. And I kind of want to hear your forecast for them as I struggle to find them in this never-ending. I'm going to the search bar. Thank you for this. Okay, here we go. Virginia Tech, you got 8.5 at plus money. They return a ton of production. Now, it's always the classic. If you return a bunch of guys that don't know what they're doing, is that really helpful? But to me, 7-6 last year. Drones, I'm very high on at quarterback. I like him. I think he's a dark horse Heisman candidate. Non-con. Vandy, Marshall, Old Dominion, and Rutgers, Stanford. Okay, workable. They're at Miami, home to Clemson. They don't play Florida State. They don't play NC State. They don't play Louisville. I think you piece together 9-3, 10-2 for the Hokies this year.
Yeah, they should run the table in non-conference.
I would hope.
Yeah. And Miami, Clemson, even if you pencil those as losses,
fine.
You can pretty clearly see how this gets over. That's only 2 games, and you have a lot of wiggle room there. As far as this team, like Drones, I think was awesome and could have been even better. He was the 64th most efficient quarterback last year. That's just with what he put on the field, which doesn't take into consideration stuff like his receivers dropped more than 10% of his on-target passes. That was a bottom 10 rate in the country. That's just absolutely inexcusable from these receivers. And I think they'll be better, largely just because you bring back your number one in Allie Jennings, and some of the other players that were actually among your better pass catchers are still there, like Jalen Lane. So should be better, just assuming these, and Nick Gallo, their tight end, was hurt. So, I mean, they should be much better in terms of what they put on the field with the receivers. Offensive line, 6 players that started games for them last year. That should be another strength of this team, having this one of the better offensive lines in this conference. And then on defense, the defense was the strength of the team last year, and they basically lost nobody. Their only major departures were on the interior defensive line. They backfilled those with some pretty strong starters in the transfer portal. You get Aeneas Peebles from Duke, you get Kevin Gilliam from Oklahoma, and then you have a high recruit like Curtis Perry from Alabama. He's a former 4-star, hasn't played much, but that'll happen at Alabama. Yeah, really good roster and an easy schedule as far as this conference goes. I honestly don't hate that it's sort of like top heavy and then you play a bunch of bad teams. Your losses are your losses. We care about the wins here, and they have a ton of winnable games.
They really do, and they're strong at home. I like them. I like their coach. This is a team, I don't think they're ready to threaten Miami, Florida State, Clemson in that realm, but I think they really find a nice kind of second tier right there, and they win the games they need to. They'll take some losses. There's no doubt about it. This line has moved. Again, I already dropped this inside the ropes, and we got some good value there, but I am high on Virginia Tech. All right, before we move to the desert, because we're going to talk about both Arizona and Arizona State, I do want to mention what we got going on here at OddsShopper. A lot of big changes, and you're going to be seeing these changes in action, but one of them that we couldn't be more excited about is this marketplace, where we have decided to take all that content that you guys love from all our people and put it available for anyone to say, okay, I want to get more college football. Well, the man himself, Matt Gajewski, will be here. I want whatever the hell I'm doing, from soccer to golf, all sorts of things. Come on in. You can. I don't truly know what Aton does, but he does some things. Guy's an absolute character. He will be here, and we're going to be adding quickly, not just people here, but all sorts of content creators right here. Come and find your home for what you want. You get that Discord. You get the picks. You get the content, and we're going to be here. So, again, the initial stages, we would love to have you as part. If you are looking to bet college football this year, there is no better spot to stop in for Mr. Gajewski. I will be there as well. So really, really exciting stuff. Again, you're going to hear more about this in future episodes, but I would be crazy not to at least tease it of what we've got going on with OddsShopper and the launch of our brand new marketplace, where you can just get more information from the people you see every day on this very channel. Now, let's go to the desert. We'll go to Arizona State first. Talk to me about the former Fighting Herm Edwards. What are we expecting from this team this year?
Yeah, my goodness, what he did with that roster, he should be in jail.
It's not good.
I actually like their head coach. The problem is, there's kind of like a stain on this program now, and it's been hard for him to get players to go here. And 48th in recruiting, 29th in the transfer portal. We've got a new OC, Marcus Arroyo, largely a failure with UNLV. I don't know. The initial back-end stuff isn't great for Arizona State. And then you start looking at this roster, and I mean, holy smokes. Their quarterback is going to be some combination of Trenton Bourguet, who had to start games for them last year, Sam Levitt, who was atrocious at Michigan State. Now, I must say, he was a 4-star freshman thrown into an atrocious situation, so I don't want to completely write him off. And Jeff Sims. I mean, you saw what he did at Nebraska, and I'm not sure how his career has gone this way, but he actually had a somewhat decent freshman season with Georgia Tech, and it's seemingly just gone downhill. I don't know if you have a single good option here. Bourguet's on his 7th offensive coordinator in college football, which is insane. He's been terrible all along the way. Their skill position players, I guess, are somewhat neutral. I think they lost their best player in Elijah Badger, and I'm not sure they backfilled it really well. They bring in like Malik McClain at receiver. It's not good. So you're down your top pass catcher. All the guys you returned, Gull Arroyo, Mir, and Stovall, were pretty bad. As far as the line, this unit was not great last year. They were 79th in pass blocking, 120th in run blocking. They tried to backfill that with portal guys. I mean, this is probably going to be a bad offensive line. Their defense is pure portal, and I think they have a lot of room for growth on this side of the ball. They weren't any good last year. They were 117th. So, I mean, you're trying to sort of paper mache your way over really, really bad problems. And a lot of the players they brought in, I'm not sure they're like full starting caliber in this conference, at least the ones with experience. You do have some pretty good 4-stars that came down to this level, like LaTerrence Welch from LSU, for example. But I mean, this is, I personally think a bottom 2 or 3 roster in this conference is pretty bad overall. Your non-con, you got no favors. Nope. Wyoming, that's a legit team. Now, Arizona State will be favored, but Wyoming plays a weird style of offense. Luckily, they get that one at home and they don't have to travel to Laramie. Mississippi State's probably a loss. Texas State is arguably the best team in the Sun Belt. I mean, that's a very tough non-con with, I'm not sure they have a single cupcake in there. Anything from, 0-3 to 2-1 is in the range of outcomes. And then in conference, you have a decent road trip to Texas Tech. You play some of the top dogs in the conference, including Kansas, Utah, Oklahoma State, UCF, Kansas State, Arizona themselves. There's a very tough schedule for Arizona State. And I think right now, I personally have them favored in 2 games all season long if everything goes according to plan with this roster. It's an absolutely dreadful roster. You're going to have to lay some juice on an under 4.5, but there's no way, in my opinion, this team gets to 5 games.
This team is live. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but we got to go hot take. This team is live to win 0 games. There are scenarios where they don't win. They have no gimmies on the whole schedule. Like, I'm sure they'll get a couple, but
yeah, BYU's a dumpster fire. That's probably
bad.
They're probably. Do you think BYU or Wyoming is an easier win? So Wyoming's in week 1. Luckily, they play Wyoming at home. If that was in Laramie,
that's words in my mouth. If they were in Laramie, I would probably bet that game. I still might bet it, but I mean, BYU's. I'm pretty down on BYU. I'm not gonna lie, but do they only have 3 non-con?
Yes.
Okay, that's even shadier. This team. But let's go to the brighter side of the street here with their rivals. Arizona's been a team honestly on this show. They've been a friend of the show. You've talked about them for quite a while. The talent in recruiting, particularly at wide receiver, and some of the stuff that they've done with their coaching staff, they've been on the ascension. Do they continue to climb this year, in your opinion?
Yeah, we luckily we were fans when they brought in Jed Fish, and he immediately started proving he was an awesome recruiter, getting like Ted McMillan, who has shown immense strides, elite recruit that he formerly had. But now you lose Jed Fish, who rebuilt your program from the absolute dumpsters of the former Pac-12. You join what is likely to be a tougher conference, like top to bottom, maybe not just the overall high end, but seemingly a dark horse wins this conference every year. And you move to Brent Brennan as head coach. I mean, like, this was one of the more puzzling hires to me in all the offseason. The guy was 34-48 with San Jose State. He's been their head coach for 7 years. I mean, like, he wasn't even successful at that level of competition. You bring in Dino Babers as your OC. I mean, he's been the head coach of Syracuse for a while, but he runs like this exceedingly complex offense. And all reports coming out of Arizona right now are that it's taking some time for this to get together. And I mean, you do have a lot of departures for this team on top of the changes you're making. You look at this team, Fafita's back, that's awesome, but you lose one of your elite receivers in Jacob Cowing. Your offensive line lost Jordan Morgan to the NFL, and Raymond Polito, the presumed heir apparent, is out for the season. The offensive line wasn't that good outside of Morgan, so I've got questions there. The backup receivers for this team last year had no production. So instead of Cowing, you're turning to like Montana Lamonius Craig, who was basically no experience. Malachi Riley, allegedly having a good camp, we'll see. And Romello Murphy, he's from Old Dominion. And then this defense, you've one returning starter on the defensive line. You're basically paper macheing over that with all transfers. And the back end, I'm not sure is all that good either. This is a schedule that I don't know is necessarily that workable. Luckily, you've got like a 2-game runway New Mexico, and Northern Arizona. But your third non-con game is actually against Kansas State. You know, like this conference has some weird non-con stuff because of previously scheduled games with the additions they made. So you're playing 10 conference games if you're Arizona, and this is a tough schedule. I mean, you've got Kansas State, Utah, that's at Utah, Texas Tech, West Virginia, I think is an awesome team, UCF, and TCU. Man, I currently have them as 6-6. There's quite a bit of value towards the under if you do think that's where they finish. Definitely have some upside given the talent, but I'm not sure I'm buying what they've done to fill their voids. This team is 85th in recruiting, 85th under Brent Brennan. Like, for all the transfers they brought in, they had some departures too. Jed Fish took some. I mean, like, this team is not deep. They have problems at some of their extremely important positions. This is a team I'm going to be shorting.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that they couldn't get more runway with him, obviously, with Washington now. I want to like Arizona, but you mentioned it. This schedule is just, yeah, sure, they're going to be 2-0. But then they also might be like 3-6. There's going to be a string of losses there that I think are tough, and they absolutely have to, in my opinion, win. They got to beat Colorado. They got to beat Houston. They're going to have to beat Arizona State and probably Texas Tech. If they get all of those, they're still only at 6. And I'm not sure they get all of them, to be honest.
So I especially like this at an 8. You have some push equity. The juice is what it is. I mean, if you bet at 7.5, whatever side you choose, that's the juice is all accounted for. So, I mean,
yeah,
you're not getting much value there. But yeah, you mentioned it. I think you're likely looking at, because, you know, like Kansas State, for whatever reason, scheduling stuff is a non-con game. You are probably 2-1, and then let's be generous. Beat BYU, Houston, Arizona State. I think that's very likely. You've got 5 wins. Where are the other ones coming from? Texas Tech is no pushover. Colorado has a very good starting roster. Depth is a question, but that's not a given either. Definitely not a given. This Colorado team is better than they were, and they were already like kind of frisky last year. And that doesn't even put you at the over, especially if you go under 8 wins, which is widely available. Like, you need to knock off at least 2 of Utah, Kansas State, West Virginia, UCF, and TCU.
Yeah, I don't.
At least 2.
Some of those teams are, you mentioned West Virginia. They'll be in some future episodes because I really do like them. Kansas State, yeah. It's tough. It's a tough scene for Arizona. They're going to be better than Arizona State, but that's about all they've got to show for it. All right, we're going to keep it moving. We're halfway home. We're going to start getting into some real goblin teams, which is the best part of the show. Not yet, but Pittsburgh is on the cusp. So there's somebody, as we were filming this, I've seen a couple of tweets from you about Pittsburgh, not in a good way. They're already losing personnel. You've got a 5.5 win total. Tough year for the Panthers ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's just time for a coaching change. They are not living up to the current expectations of the conference in college football. I mean, this is why you see teams like Clemson and Florida State trying to leave the ACC. Your conference is a joke outside of the top teams. Yeah, Miami, Clemson, Florida State are awesome. And then, you know, year over year, you have one of the under recruiting teams puts it all together and has like 18 seniors. NC State was that last year. This year it's probably Virginia Tech. But outside of that, your conference is a disaster, complete disaster. Like the Big Ten, at least, most of the coaches that were disasters at the bottom end have gotten fired and they're trying to do stuff. Narduzzi, formerly, I mean, with like Kenny Pickett and stuff, brought this team to the title game. Since NIL and the transfer portal become fixtures of college football, he's completely taken the Dabo Swinney approach where he's like, I don't care about this. We're just going to stay in our ways and get run over by teams. They're a feeder team for the other teams in the P4 now. They have a new OC in Cade Bell. I mean, he comes from Western Carolina. This is basically an air raid offense. They pass 53% of the time in a 7-4 season. They're going to play a lot faster. I don't know if their offense is built for this. Like Nate Yarnell is your quarterback. You did nothing to fix your quarterback situation. Yarnell couldn't beat out Velo last year, who, I'm not kidding, I ran a study, 178 quarterbacks that threw at least 100 passers. He was dead last in efficiency, and Yarnell was behind him. I mean, I don't know. Offensive line, they do return 5 players. This unit was a complete disaster last year. They were 91st in pass blocking, 132nd in run blocking. Even if you do see incremental improvement from all of these players, they're still not even average. Their receivers are horrible. We referenced, these quarterbacks. This was Kyron Jones we were talking about, who had receivers that dropped over 10% of their on-target passes. Pittsburgh was on that list. They returned one guy in Kanata Mumpfield, and the rest of the team is unproven or horrible, looking at Dejon Reynolds. And their defense, we've already named a couple of their defenders that got picked off by other teams that we talked about as, teams we liked. But, here's some of the elite players they lost. Solomon DeShields at linebacker, Shane Simon, linebacker, Dayon Hayes on the edge, Bangale Kamara as a linebacker. This team, they don't add any transfers either. They're 50th in the transfer portal. A lot of that's just like a couple high-end recruits that don't have any experience. We haven't even gotten to their schedule. This team is a complete disaster. They're going to need to run the table in non-con, which I don't think they do. They play West Virginia and Cincinnati. Kent State and Youngstown are easy enough, probably a 2-2 split. But then from the top of this conference, you do have Louisville, you have Clemson, you still have North Carolina, and I do think they're honestly worse than every team on their schedule except for Virginia. There's a very real chance this team wins 3 games. So absolutely smashing and under, running this one up to the window with Pittsburgh. This roster is a bottom 2 or 3 roster in this conference.
Yeah, it's a tough scene for the old Panthers. There's not much to say. You mentioned their quarterback situation. It starts and ends there for me. Just not a team that I am high on whatsoever.
Why are you running the air raid with Nate Yarrow?
I did again. It just the fact that they were ahead of or behind the Iowa quarterbacks tells you everything you need to know.
Deacon Hill was 177.
Christian of course. Like if you're behind that, that's just, we need to shut it down. That just can't be the answer. It's tough. The team, like I said, there's so much talent, so many good teams of years past. It's not happening right now. All right, this is a mystery team. I'll be honest. Some of these teams, just by breaking them down myself, I had a pretty strong inkling of where you're going. Iowa State's a team I really don't know what you're thinking. Last year when we were doing our previews, they were one of the more awkward teams because they had all these guys suspended for gambling and whatnot. It was just a weird situation in Ames. I think that's where this college is. If not, sorry, I only know a couple cities in Iowa. 7.5 wins. What are we doing with the Cyclones?
So this conference is interesting. Just looking at the landscape up top, you have Utah and you have Kansas State. They're kind of like co-favorites to win this conference. And then you interestingly have some peculiar odds, like Oklahoma State is 3rd. They return a lot of production, so I somewhat get it. But you have these really competent teams sort of in this plus 900, plus 950 range to win this conference, depending on where you shop. That's Kansas, Iowa State, and UCF. I do think there's merit to taking somewhat long shots on all of them to win the conference. But Iowa State's a team I particularly like, given what they went through last year. They had the gambling scandal, lost a few starters on both sides of the ball. And that's allowed a lot of young players to accrue some really meaningful experience. Rocco Becht was 63rd in quarterback efficiency last year, playing behind a dreadful offensive line. That unit now returns every single player. Very, very inexperienced unit last year, very young. So expecting a jump forward. They had a pair of transfers, Dylan Barnett from Wisconsin, and then Jalen Travis from Princeton. He was good at that level of competition, but you never really know with these up transfers, especially from the Ivy League. Abu Sama was efficient at running back, even behind that offensive line. So you basically have everybody back. Receiver, you have 2 studs, Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel. Both these players extremely efficient with Rocco Becht. You're basically running it back with everyone last year. And this defense is what we really need to talk about. This is what wins them games. If the offense can play competent, that I think would be good in and of itself. Defense was 34th last year. They lost 1 starter. This team was awesome, especially up front. They're 22nd in run defense. They returned both their defensive tackles, 2 absolute studs there. They returned both their edge rushers, and they went out and they added Kennard Snyder from UL Monroe. He was elite in that conference. This is a edge group that should be better. Linebacker, you return everyone of consequence. Defensive back, your only departure was TJ Tampa, which is a big drop, but you have 4 returning starters. You have a couple players that did play rotational roles that were solid. They bring in a 4-star transfer in Ryan Robinson, and they actually recruited a 4-star freshman in Marcus Neal in the secondary. Then you look at the schedule. I am a little concerned with that week 1 game. It's an FCS game, North Dakota, but you look at rankings, they're the number 1 preseason FCS team. Still, this is Iowa State we're talking about. They should win that game. You play Iowa in non-con, it's tough. You go on the road, but it's not really a true road game. The only thing that changes is in the stadium. I think they can win that game. Then it's Arkansas State. They should run them over. But you look in conference, you have a couple tough games up top. They play Utah and Kansas State to close the year. But honestly, this roster, I think, is closer to some of those teams than people expect. So I think a long shot is worthwhile. If you're a little scared off of that, 7.5 wins, I think, is fine. Biggest concern is going to be that O-line, but everyone's back. I think this is a team that can get it done at a longer shot price.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that is a conference that it doesn't seem to have a ton of consensus, and they do dodge Kansas. Yeah, they have no, they don't. That's the last game of the year. Man, they finish. What a tough stretch to close the year. Utah and Kansas State for them. That is tough, but interesting. I think it comes down to non-con. You mentioned those are winnable games, but those are not gimme games. Arkansas State, they can play. There's no doubt about it. But I always like to see Iowa State doing some good things. Over 7.5.
And it's like a longer shot for a reason. It's plus 950.
No, absolutely. You gotta, again, it's all about the price that you're getting. We talk about that a lot, whether it's a win total, a future, a game line. Everything's a play at a certain price, and everything's a pass at a certain price. All right, let's talk a little Maryland football again. Middling. 6.5, 6-7 wins, fighting for a bowl. The line right now is 6.5, slightly juiced to the under. Is that how you see it?
The 6.5, unfortunately, is not available to me, but I am confident enough to take this at a 5.5, which should tell you a lot. And this is like a crazy situation for Maryland. They are a team that has been the victim of the former division structure in the Big Ten, constantly getting victimized by the 3 best teams they play against. Now, the first season you open it up and you have no divisions, they basically lose all their good players. You don't have Talia Tagovailoa anymore, who just bailed this team out of so many bad situations previously over the years. They add MJ Morris in the transfer portal. I don't know that he beats out Billy Edwards, and if that is a problem you're having, this is a terrible situation. MJ Morris was 165th in efficiency last year. Wasn't his best year. You go back to 2022, he was 111th. And then Billy Edwards was arguably even worse on the very small sample he appeared in games. You do have a couple decent skill position players. Hemby at running back, Prather and Felton at receiver are pretty good. But this is a bottom 3 offensive line in the Big Ten. I don't think it's even particularly debatable. You have 2 starters back for this unit. The players you brought into the transfer portal to potentially replace them, you already lost one of them in Isaiah Wright. He started like 27 consecutive games or something. It was over 20. I can't remember the exact number. That was at Buffalo. He already got hurt. So now you're relying on Alan Herron from Shorter, Josh Kaltenberger from Purdue, and Aluba from Georgia. At least he's a decent recruit. And the offensive line already wasn't exactly a strength last year. They were middling in both pass blocking and run blocking. So you don't recruit well. You don't have any quality transfers, and you only have 2 guys back. That, I think, is a big concern. Not to mention, these weren't particularly the best players on your team. Defense, the best part of this team was their secondary. They were 19th in coverage. They only have 2 starters back from this unit. And they went and they tried to add in 1 transfer. It's Jalen Husky from Bowling Green. It's a massive step up in competition. There's just a lot of places they need to actually replace the production they lost. And they didn't do that at all. This team has like 5 total transfers, 6 total transfers, only 1 on defense. And they were terrible up front. Couldn't rush the passer or defend against the run. Not to mention, you look at this schedule, I don't think their non-con is easy. You play Villanova, but they're favored over UConn and they should be favored over Virginia. I wouldn't necessarily just write those off as wins. In conference, up top, you play USC. They're worse than Minnesota. Oregon, they're worse than Rutgers, Iowa, and Penn State. Like, where does this team get 7 wins? So, I mean, if you can, I just wish the 6.5 was available to me. It's not, living in an illegal state, Wisconsin. But I mean, you're looking at like even money under 6.5 wins. Just like where do they get 7?
Yeah, 7's going to be a stretch. You mentioned, sure, you could rip off 3, but that's one of those. Okay, if they go 3-0, great. They still got a challenge. If they don't, you can forget it. You can forget it at 2-1. That's just not going to cut it. If you drop a game to an FCS school or someone like UConn gets you, that is just not going to work. So I'm with you. This is a team that I really didn't have a strong take on, but I may have to add them to the card here momentarily, because it does seem like a little dire situation for Maryland here in a pretty tough spot. And 6.5, you're minus 130, but that's not anything major juice wise. Let me check again.
Yeah, I have them as like roughly a pick 'em against Minnesota. That line should be around 1. They're worse than Northwestern. Northwestern, they have a ton of problems on offense, but their defense returns like everybody, and they were good last year on defense. They're clearly worse than Minnesota. They're clearly worse than Rutgers. And then, I mean, Iowa, Penn State, USC, like even Indiana. I think this team is significantly worse than Indiana, and that's a game on the road.
Yeah, that's just sad. And those are the type of games, there's no wiggle room. There is no wiggle room. You have to have that type of game to get to 7. All right. We got a couple more for you. A couple different things, though. One, I already mentioned what we've got going on at the marketplace. But if there's a team, and we're going to be doing plenty of previews, but say you're like, man, they didn't talk about Kennesaw State, I need to know, just tweet us. We will be happy to talk to you on social media, Matt_Gajewski at JazzRazBets. And of course, if you are inside the ropes at the marketplace in the Discord, I know Matt, I can speak for him, happy to talk about any team anywhere with all the data that he has. And I would be glad to do the same. And then finally, before we get, because we're going to the Sun Belt, I want to mention, if people are looking for ways to you say, man, a lot of win totals, I don't have the bankroll. One of the best ways is to get involved in these deals that the books are offering. If you're in a state with Bet365, $150 in bonus bets is still out there. Bet 5, get 150. Don't do a future, bet something today, because win or lose, you get that money. Bet a baseball game, live a little. Here are the following states that it's in: Arizona, Indiana, Iowa, North Carolina, New Jersey, Colorado, Louisiana, Ohio, Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania is here. It is that simple. The link is below. Got to be 21 plus. 18 in Kentucky. If you have a gambling problem, please call 1-800-GAMBLER. Now, let's get back to business here. I'm going to kick this off with actually another fascinating team that I'm really excited to talk about, and I'm going to take a shot with, and that is Troy. Troy, who's been awesome in recent years, no doubt about it. And you can just see from their win total, expectations have certainly changed. This has moved down again. I have this already on my card at 7. It's moved to 6.5. At minus 110, I'm still willing to take a short of Troy. But I want to kind of hear almost philosophically what you do with a team that was so good. They were 11-3 last year, and it is a complete overhaul. They lost everybody from Gunnar Watson down to the rest of the roster. Nevada, at Memphis, at Iowa, Florida A&M. That's a win. It's not the easiest non-con, but what do you make of Troy? Is it a team that you've looked at? And again, just a complete overhaul of the roster.
Yeah, you lose an elite head coach who moves over to Tulane. You bring in Notre Dame's OC, Jared Parker. I don't know. He is what he is. I think he's an average hire at best. But with these teams in the Sun Belt and really the G5 across the board, they're feeder teams for these Power 4 programs. So you need to do a couple things: recruit, and you need to take these players that actually, maybe they were at Alabama or Georgia, 4 and 5 stars that couldn't get on the field. Try to bring those guys in, or maybe that's a little bit rich, but your high 3 stars from some of these other programs. This team is 107th in transfers. They brought in nobody. And, instead of taking that approach, they have one of the highest number of JUCO transfers in the country. So, I mean, we're going really low level for a lot of these players, and there's absolutely no returning production. You got 2 offensive linemen back, 1 receiver, 1 tight end, 2 starters on defense, both linebackers, which was not their strongest unit. Papered over that with a ton of JUCO guys. Really unfortunate situation. Probably the best returner on their whole team, Chris Lewis, had an offseason cancer diagnosis, so he's not going to be there. I mean, I personally think this is the second worst team in the entire Sun Belt. I have them power rated only ahead of Louisiana Monroe. So even if you're optimistic with this team and give them 3 wins against Nevada, UL Monroe, and Florida A&M, how do they find more wins?
I honestly don't know. I like I said, I think there's just a recency bias of, oh, they're getting double-digit wins. This is not even close to the same team. Texas State, Arkansas State, South Alabama, Coastal, Georgia Southern, Southern Miss, Louisiana. No,
most of those teams are pretty good.
I don't see wins in those. And you mentioned, sure, Nevada stinks. Florida A&M is not obviously a serious opponent. I don't think they're going to beat Memphis on the road, and I don't think they're going to beat Iowa on the road. I think this team honestly is like going like 4-8, to be honest. I love it at 7. If you can still find 7 and push equity, I laid that. It was maybe my first win total bet of the season. I still like it at 6.5 though. I'm calling for a huge step back for Troy this year.
I mean, they return on defense. They return 2 players that were in their top 16 in terms of snaps. They returned 5 that were in their top 21. And I mean,
yeah, that's not it.
Their top returner, Jordan Stringer, was their worst defender efficiency-wise. Terry Thomas, their only other returning defender, was their second worst efficiency-wise. You just look at above average play across the board on defense. They only had 2 players that finished below average efficiency-wise on defense. Those are the 2 guys they returned.
Not great. And again, it's not just that they lost a coach and a quarterback that know what they're doing. You can't just slide players into that.
And all their coordinators. Summerall brought them all with him.
Yeah. Now, I will say on the positive, I believe their starting quarterback's name is Goose, and that is really, really sick.
He's actually a decent recruit. He formerly was with West Virginia.
That's an awesome name, but, a name can only take you so far. So shout out to Goose. Talk to me, Goose, but I don't really see it. Now, let's stay in the Sun Belt, though, because there is a team that I just alluded to in Arkansas State that we want to talk about right now. And, man, last year, I remember watching them lose legitimately by 80 points to open the year. Then they found something, particularly with their freshman quarterback. Talk to me about Arkansas State and what we see there.
They were one of the youngest teams in the country last year, and now they're returning like every single player on their team, basically. And this should be something that helps them moving forward. This is the best recruiting team in the Sun Belt. They've been top 3 in recruiting each of the last 3 years. So they're sort of stacking depth, which is not something that a lot of teams are doing in this conference, especially when teams are getting rated. You return, I mean, this is crazy. They return 13 players, with starting experience on the offense. Again, that's looking at players that had over 300 snaps. Their quarterback, Jalen Rayner, was extremely efficient. I think there's maybe only an argument that perhaps McLeod and Aguilar for Texas State and App State are better than him. And Rayner's in that conversation. He's a dual threat, awesome efficiency, and he was only a freshman. So there is plenty of room for improvement. Not to mention, a problem with a lot of these teams is the depth. Aside from what they did in recruiting, they brought in Timmy McClain. This is a legitimate backup, and like a ton of teams, they don't have starters. They don't have backups either. So, I mean, having both is important. Deep at running back, you have 2 players with starting experience there. They basically return all their important starting receivers, losing only Jeff Foreman, but Courtney Jackson and Corey Rucker are back. They add some weird players, like they bring in Malik Hornsby as a receiver. Guy is hyper athletic, just tried to play quarterback too long. Goldie Lawrence is a former 4-star and top 500 recruit with Florida State. I mean, this is a talented group, and that was what they were doing year over year. Like Jaquez Cross is from Purdue, Courtney Jackson's from Syracuse. They have a lot of good P5 at the time transfers that have now come down. You got 5 starters back on your O-line. This unit's actually pretty good. They dealt with a ton of injuries last year, so I do think they're better than the 91st in pass blocking, 26 run blocking, before you even factor in a step up year over year. And then I think the big concern that people are looking to is this defense. They were 58th in efficiency. This defense wasn't quite as bad as some people were saying. They were 71st in run defense, 117th in pass rush, 15th in coverage. So immediately you've got 3 starters back in your secondary. Those players are all pretty good. You bring in 2 former starters, Jordan Mahoney from UMass, Adrian Cole at FIU. The level of competition is not a huge jump for them. I think they can actually come in and start. Where you are really weak is up front. So they returned 2 defensive tackles. I think that is completely fine for this team, but they added a ton of guys in the transfer portal, like Micah Overton's from Texas A&M. This is a really high-level player coming in to man the interior that already has 2 returners back. On the edge, you bring in Noah Collins, Kamari Stevens, and Brian Whitehead. I mean, these players are above average or pretty good recruits. I'm expecting a decent step up for this team. Not to mention one of their best starters, Charles Willikis, is back at linebacker. You took a lot of good transfers that, I mean, like getting a Texas A&M transfer at Arkansas State is pretty good. So I'm thinking this defense is above average. And right now, there are 5.5s in the market sitting out there. I'm fine with 6.5. And I think this team is worth a long shot bet if you can find like a 15-1 to win the conference. That, in my opinion, they play on the weaker side of this division too. It's basically them and Texas State. And that was a wild game last year if you go back and look at it. So Arkansas State definitely live for a Sun Belt title, at least berth. You could bet that too, but I think they could win it.
Yeah, over 5.5, you're certainly going to lay the juice, but you can find 6.5 at big plus money, almost upwards of plus 150.
That's what I have. 6.5 plus 150. I think they win like 8 games.
So, yeah, I mean, they've got one, Central Arkansas. They've got Michigan and Iowa State, but other than that,
they play the 4 worst teams in this conference. They play the bottom 4 teams. Yeah. Monroe, Dominion, Southern Miss, and Georgia State.
Right there. And then you've got Tulsa. That's not a huge deal. And then you've got some pretty tough, reasonable games. But I like this team. I think they're very, very dangerous. You mentioned Texas State. That's former Malik Hornsby's home. My man. He's just bouncing around from team to team. But yeah, keep an eye on Arkansas State. I am with you there. All right. There's only one way to round out any show that we do. We do it the same every year. And that is to close with UMass. The UMass Minutemen, they make the show every single year. And honestly, they're going to be okay this year. Normally, we're talking about winning 2 games. Now they got to win 4 games. We're stepping it up this year. Can UMass get to 4 wins? The answer is resoundingly yes. Here's how they do it. 1, you've got Central Connecticut State and Wagner. That's 2. It better be 2, but it will be 2. Then they play kind of a bizarre schedule. They're basically in the MAC at this point. They play 5 MAC teams and UConn. That is 6 games that they've got to win 2. They got to go 2 and 4 of those 6 because the other 4 games on their schedule are Missouri, Georgia, Liberty, and Mississippi State. Those are you're drawing to a meteor hitting for them to win 3-9 last year. I think UMass is going to be all right. They've got stability at quarterback. They brought in some decent talent from across the country. I think they can beat the Eastern Michigans of the world, those type of teams, Miami of Ohio's of the world. You get 2 FCS games. I honestly think UMass wins 4 games this year.
Yeah, I think they win 4 games too. This has moved to 4.5 in a lot of spots. If you can still find a 4, I think that's worthwhile.
3.5 minus 125 is out there.
Yeah, I live in Wisconsin. I only have 4.5s available to me. So I think, 4s, 3.5s, whatever you can find worthwhile. They have a ton of great transfers. You got a returning quarterback like Frank Ladson. He's a former elite recruit from Clemson's now on UMass. Guys traveling all over the country. Sterling Galban is on this team now. I mean, these are pretty good receivers that he's going to be throwing to when they do throw. Galban from Jacksonville State. Offensive line replaces quite a bit, but I mean, this team brought in 8 transfers on the offensive line. And some of these players are of pretty solid caliber, like Braden Romas from Cal. Mal Glynn is from Cincinnati. Paul Chio, Georgia Tech. Benjamin Roy, UCLA. Brian Kilbane was a starter at Akron. Like, this is legitimate Power 5 players coming down. Not all of them are elite recruits, but still, it's experience. And defense, I'm not sure. They're basically paper macheing over the 132nd defense with a ton of transfers. They literally cannot be worse. They have one spot they could go down. But, like, some of these players are pretty decent. Like Jalen Hudson on the edge from Wake Forest. Etanosa Rubin from Georgia Tech. I mean, Rubin formerly played at Clemson. I mean, there's some legitimate guys on this defense coming in. Ryan Barnes from Notre Dame in the secondary. I mean, this is not a poverty roster anymore. They do have some tough games, but man, like this is a more talented UMass than we're used to. They're 79th in the transfer portal. That's pretty good.
Yeah. And again, I don't care. They have 4 unwinnable games. That's fine. They got to go 4-4 in the other ones. They've got 2 gimme games. And so to me, when you only need 4, that's the way to do it.
Eastern Michigan is pathetic.
That's what I'm saying.
If so is Buffalo.
Those are the games right there. And just looking at it, I was just looking at this, just for context, UMass is a pick'em against Eastern Michigan in that first game. Like you get that one, we're off to the races. I actually kind of like UMass in that game, to be honest.
Eastern Michigan stinks.
Yeah, it's bad. You mentioned Buffalo. Northern Illinois is going to be a little tricky, but even UConn, you could get them. They've done that in the past. Regardless, don't sleep on the Minutemen. They're not going to go bowling, but they are going to win 4 games. Look at that. Many schools up, many schools down. Again, we're going to be diving into conference previews, and then you know what time it is. Week 1, week 0. Me and Matt will be breaking down all the games, and I know he's got a lot of plans for what he's going to be offering inside the ropes here at Odd Chopper, from the data, all the usage, to certainly the egregious games. We like to talk college football, and I know you guys like it as well. If you want to see more, last year we were doing 2 episodes a week. If you want to see that, best way, support. Let us know. Tell us, hey, we want more, and we will do more. I couldn't be more excited. Matt, any final words before we put a bow on the first episode of the season?
Very much excited for the season, so appreciate you all being here. Let us know what you want to see. Yep. Like to tailor the show. It's your show. We do it for you, so obviously let us know. And I think that's it. Just appreciate you all. Thank you.
Yep. It's going to be a great year, and we're excited. So hopefully you got some win totals on the docket for me, for Mr. Gajewski, and for all of us here at Odd Chopper. Good luck. Stay tuned for more episodes dropping. It's going to be a great year of college football.